Homelands is a pretty bad set, at least mechanically. I find this especially interesting, and I wanted to know why it is what it is, I guess. So let's go over what I found. I think there's no better place to start than looking at what the actual designers of the set had to say about it. There was a comic released called Homelands on the World of Magic the Gathering, issue number 1. They only made one issue. And in that comic is an article written by one of the two designers. You can also find this article hosted on mtglore.com. We're not really going to talk about the lore of the set today, at least that's not our main focus. But I think the first part of this article will help provide a little context here. Hello, my name is Scott Hungerford, and I'm one of the designers of the expansion, along with Kyle Namvar, who's also head of the customer service department at Wizards of the Coast. I started working for Wizards of the Coast as a customer service representative about 16 months ago, but Kyle and I first got the idea some 9 months before that, on a beautiful sunny afternoon amidst the chaos of Wade Racine's living room. We were sitting on the floor sorting out Antiquities TM cards for the customer service reps to use while they answered calls and letters, when the conversation came around to whether we should try to design our own set. In all seriousness, I'm sure that everyone who plays Magic talks about this at some point, but when we started talking about where Baron Sengir came from, and whether there was a Heirloom Vale, it all came together in a flash. A name? Homelands. An epic about the concept of home and the cultures of some of the most unique creatures in the universe of Domina. Admittedly, there have been a lot of changes since then. The setting for the Homelands expansion has been placed on a separate plane, far removed from the locations of the previous card sets. We focused more on new cultures than old, but still kept enough of the old flavor to answer questions about the origins of the Sengir vampires, or whether there are other minotaurs inhabiting Domina. But the feel and flavor of that first day is still there, even with all the changes and the chaos that have occurred throughout the design process. Kyle did the lion's share of the rules for Homelands, and I did the bulk of the set's story work. But we crossed over into each other's territories many times. We frequently spent hours together theorizing about the philosophy and characters of Homelands. At other times, we hashed out rules and card ideas, while we sat on his front stoop watching the sun go down on the horizon. Over the course of the last 2 years, especially in the final editing and production process, well over 100 people have lent their talent, skill, and expertise to the set. And quite a bit of humor and creativity as well. Homelands, in my mind and heart, is really Wizards of the Coast's set, and belongs to every last person who has struggled to see it through to completion, even while coping with a company undergoing exponential growth. Over the course of the year that I worked in customer service, I also traveled all over the country to gaming conventions as a rep for Wizards of the Coast. I played a lot of gunslinger magic during my tours, taking on all challengers with the somewhat decent decks I put together. By the way, while I'm not anywhere near the strongest Magic player out there, I'm not the weakest either. Still, I must have played about 2,000 games of Magic at those cons, and I only won about a quarter of those. This is mainly because I don't own any really expensive cards. I hate playing against control decks, and I'm not especially good at blocking 128 power, 1 toughness, mountain walking, fire breathing kobolds. Getting to my point, I talked to a lot of you out there over that year, real people in the real world who had concerns about our game, and comments about what they like and don't like about the cards and rules. 2,000 people may be only a small fraction of those of you who play Magic, but a lot of your comments made a sizable impact in shaping the ideas and flavor of Homelands. Because of that, the set is partly dedicated to everyone who was willing to talk to me while playing a game of Magic. and who was willing to deal with my half-brained antics as I played my Sorceress Queen transmutation decks against competitors who wiped the floor with my Cyclopean mummies. In the end, I think we've got a pretty strong set in Homelands. It's been a long, strange trip to this point, and I'm glad I had the chance to meet so many of you along the way. I hope you enjoy what we've done, not just the madness Kyle and I have created, but the set that all of the WotC staff have shaped over the last year. Well, first of all, I can say here that he's well spoken, and it makes sense he was in customer service, and the design goals are noble. Path to hell and all that. I don't know how much of this is sarcasm or said in. Does sound like maybe he's deflecting blame, maybe he's not, I don't know. No idea if it's genuine or not, but it is well written. Anyway, the comic that published this article came out the 1st of February 1996, and while it doesn't really say a whole lot as to what actually happened in the background, I do think it's an important step in understanding the motivations behind some of the design decisions. I've been pretty harsh on the mechanical side of this set, and the cards are bad, but I do think we really need to appreciate, or at least understand, the context around these decisions. At least if we want to try and be fair to Homelands. With that said, there's a wealth of context in an article of The Duelist, issue number 7, written by Christopher Ferris. In April 1994, Scott Hungerford and Kyle Namvar sat together in Kyle's house, sorting through the new shipment of Antiquities TM. Kyle, head of the customer service team at Wizards of the Coast, was collecting card sets to use as reference for rules questions. It would only be a short time until Scott would join the CST. He had been a Magic TM player from the beginning. At that time, expansion sets were a relatively new addition to Magic. Kyle, looking at the game mechanics of the set, was convinced that Antiquities could have been stronger. But Scott felt that Antiquities set a strong precedent because it had a coherent theme that each card developed. It introduced characters that had substance and history, and suggested tales that lent depth to the entire set. Their conversation turned away from Antiquities itself toward what could be built from the hints in the existing flavor text and card titles. So it's a little ironic that the guy responsible for Homelands thinks that Antiquities could be stronger. But to be fair, without knowing exactly what he meant, it's hard to comment on. Is this a power level thing? He is the mechanics guy. And if it is a power level thing, there are certainly cards in Antiquities that could have been stronger, like Martyrs of Corliss. But for a set with so few cards, there are some pretty strong cards in the set. Perkle's Recall is pretty busted, depending on context. Transmute and Power Artifact are the same. Yawgmoth's Demon is pretty decent for the time. Atog is a goat. Crumble and even Titania's Song are pretty playable. To say nothing of Mishra's Workshop, Mishra's Factory, or Strip Mine. It is important to remember the context, though, because I could also mention the Tron lands, but they were pretty bad at the time. Scott, however, is right when he says that the lore for Antiquities was banger as hell. I mean, it's incredible, especially considering it's the second expansion. Hours later, the foundation of Homelands TM had been laid, but the course which it would take through development, through the hands of the research and development team into the realm of artists and editors, was one Kyle and Scott could not predict. The early designs. From the outset, the two designers had very distinct visions which contributed to the formation of the expansion. Kyle wanted to create a new level of play in which subtlety and skill would become the mark of an experienced Magic player. That is certainly a noble goal. Scott was bent on the creation of a world so rich in history that the storytelling element of Magic would be as powerful as the strategy. Both of them, however, were intrigued by the possibilities that the basic set and the early expansions had opened up. The Gathering sketched out a world, but left many details unanswered. Who or what were Sengir and Sarah? Where did the merfolk come from? The two were determined to create an expansion which would answer some of these questions. Scott had read an article in the May 1994 Duelist Supplement titled The Brothers' War, A History of Antiquities. This article was a goldmine of historical information about Domina. From it arose an initial timeline and a cast of important characters for the expansion. As I said, we aren't dipping too deep into the lore of this set today, but it is important to acknowledge that there was care put into the lore, and that this was a major consideration for at least half of the development team. Skipping further down, we come to this next section, from pipe dream to proposal. After their initial brainstorm, Kyle and Scott soon began writing down ideas for individual cards, and the first version of Homelands began to take shape. But as they tackled the challenge of developing this world, they knew an even bigger challenge lay ahead: convincing Wizards of the Coast to accept their expansion for publication. Scott recalls weeks of intense labor and late nights as he and Kyle struggled to assemble the first presentable version of the set for the Magic Research and Development team. In retrospect, Scott felt that the original version was a very weak set, but Glenn Elliott, then head of R&D, had a different opinion. The set was a little underpowered, Glenn observed. The result of Kyle's first look at Legends TM, which would be released within a few months. In response to the raw power of Legends, Kyle set about creating a set that relied on strategy. So I haven't seen the original draft of Homelands, but based on the dogpile that got released, I actually agree with Glenn that this set had potential. It's also funny to hear about the raw power of Legends. It definitely had some strong cards in it, but it also released some of the worst cards available at the time. It's certainly not a bad set overall, and it has a lot of cards in it that I really love, but I think I would hesitate to call it like a powerful set or a good set. Glenn agreed that Homelands couldn't be released in its original version, but he thought the set had a lot of potential. Scott and Kyle's expansion proposal was accepted, and it was tentatively put into the queue behind the Dark. But changes in the expansion development process prompted the company to revise its initial schedule. The new process gave the expansion's designers a much larger role in the polishing of their expansion, Glenn remembers. We wanted to give Homelands the chance to be the first to use that process, but we realized that it would not be possible to put Homelands through the process and still get it out by Christmas. R&D decided to design a separate expansion, Fallen Empires, for release in the fall and to slide Homelands into the next available slot. Ice Age was already scheduled for spring 1995, so Homelands was slated for a summer 1995 release. Kyle and Scott were given until January of that year to develop a new draft of the set. I think this is a good time to remember that Wizards of the Coast was like working out of a garage a few years before this. Magic blew up huge and everybody wanted a piece of the new hotness. They were still trying to figure out how to even make sets at this point, so it makes sense that there was constant restructuring and reorganizing at the time. They were also rushed from the very beginning, as they initially planned to release sets much slower. Arabian Nights was made pretty much exclusively by Richard in like 3 months, and sets like Ice Age and Mirage were in development before Alpha released. A lot of shifting happened, and sets like Legends, The Dark, and Homelands weren't even like really planned much, as they were released simply because people wanted to make sets and people wanted more cards, and WotC needed more sets. Anyway, it just kind of makes sense that this, kind of shit happened. That being said, there are rumors that development didn't want anything to do with this set, and, how this is framed, that may or may not be true. Kind of seems like it, at least at this point. A month of desperate reconstruction. Though the release date was still months away, tremendous work remained to be done. New developments were constantly producing changes in the set. The release of Legends in June 1994 had a particularly dramatic effect on the course of the new expansion. The set introduced a new type of card, the Legend, whose characteristics were particularly suited to Baron Sengir and the other characters central to Homelands. Legends also sparked a few key card ideas. In response to Serpent Generator and Pit Scorpion, for example, Scott and Kyle added an anti-poison card to the set, one of what would turn out to be a series of cards meant to help counteract various deck strategies. Finally, the confusion over the new rules which Legends brought to the game confirmed Scott's conviction that they should strive for simplicity and clarity in the cards. That's really funny to me because one of my major complaints about Homelands is that many of the cards lack simplicity and clarity. I mean, I guess if you're going to compare Homelands cards to stuff like Raging River, Lich, Illusionary Mask, Chains of Mephistopheles, and Tackle Maggot, then yeah, the Homelands cards are pretty simple and straightforward. But I do think that they missed the mark on all of these. Or something happened later in development that messed with this. In the next few months, Scott and Kyle came back to the set again and again, changing storylines to keep the set consistent with new expansions and changing card values to keep in touch with the developments in tournament play. The design was developing well until a casual observation caused a major shakeup in the set. In November, the latest version of Homelands and 20 pages of backstory were sent to the East Coast playtesters, the group of University of Pennsylvania graduate students who had helped Richard Garfield develop the original card set for Magic, and who had designed Antiquities. Early in December, Scaphalius wrote back to the Homelands designers with a question about one of the characters from Antiquities that appeared in the new set. Wasn't Tokesha a woman? Scott fell into a panic when he realized that the article he had read in the Duelist Supplement actually had 2 more pages to it. He was horrified as he turned the page and discovered information that completely undermined the continuity of the set he and Kyle had created. I gotta say, this bit flabbergasted me. Holy shit. So, I tracked down the absolute goldmine of Antiquities lore from the Duelist Supplement, and this is what he's talking about. And these are the 2 pages he missed. To Scott's credit, this shit is fucking impossible to read and doesn't necessarily look like a continuation of the lore, but maybe it's easier to read when not scanned onto a computer screen. Man, though. If I was, like, a developer and I received 20 pages of lore written from a dude who had read a magazine article and didn't even finish most of it, I would be so fucking annoyed. It's also interesting that Tokesha was originally in Homelands. Anyway, December was a month of desperate reconstruction. The combination of the contradictory Antiquities evidence and the new elements that Ice Age would undoubtedly bring to the picture of Domina forced Scott and Kyle to rethink their whole approach. How could they create a set that explored new facets of the Magic multiverse while remaining consistent with the game's existing world? In a flash, they envisioned a plane that had been trapped or sealed from the rest of the planes in Domina. In that way, Homelands would have been spared the repercussions of the violent war between Urza and Mishra and would be free from the fallout of all that followed in the centuries of aftermath. The world of Homelands suddenly gained a powerful new identity. One of the lesser characters, then called Farazi, suddenly grew in importance, and everything about the character's history was dramatically changed. Yeah, that's pretty funny. You know the story is going to be great when you have to use multiverse shit to make it make sense. That being said, the set itself does not give away that the lore had to be pretty heavily rewritten like a month before the set's due date, so I think they did a decent job fixing this mistake. After several major overhaul, Kyle and Scott's final design was submitted to Wizards of the Coast. The remaining work on the set would be done by an experienced team of developers who would carry out the designer's vision from the final playtesting of the expansion to the creation of its unique look. Magic Project Coordinator Ron Richardson had been following the progress of Kyle and Scott's creation and stepped in to coordinate the project. Developers Dave Petty and Jim Lin led the team's work on the game's mechanics for the set. Their primary interest was to make certain that casting costs were commensurate with the abilities of cards. Likewise, they were careful to ensure the cards' abilities were appropriate for the colors they represented. It's hard to comment on the development without seeing what they started with, but the end result is cards that cost way too much mana and are overall incredibly boring game pieces. I wonder how much of this is tongue-in-cheek. Once R&D had gone through the set and adjusted each card where necessary, they sent out mock-up versions of the cards to several groups of playtesters. These groups were challenged to find broken combinations and degenerate cards, and were also requested to comment on their overall opinion of the set. The playtesters' responses were mixed, an encouraging sign, recalled Scott. If it had all been a good response, it wouldn't have been as good as if there had been some controversy. If it's a good set, some people will love it and others will hate it. While the playtest groups were busy creating decks and strategies with new cards, Kyle and Scott put together the list of cards and card titles for Sandra Everingham, art director of Magic. A Magic artist herself, Sandra worked with the designers to prepare a package for the artists that would explain the history and context of the cards they would be representing. Guidelines on how the actual image should appear, however, were kept to a minimum. In keeping with the original diverse spirit of Magic, Sandra worked to make sure that the artist's vision wasn't compromised by too much artistic direction. Sandra worked with the designers to make a few specific requests of the artists. We wanted each group of related cards to be represented by one artist whose style complemented the characters, notes Scott. Artists Pete Venters and Christopher Rush were singled out early on by the designers for particular concepts. Pete was asked to portray the royal family of Sengir, and Chris was asked to paint Abbey Gargoyles, Isan Shade, and Prophecy. Chris was also given a choice of several other cards and immediately chose Euron the Relentless, one of the chief figures among the red cards, and Rashka the Slayer, a vampire hunter. I wanted the Baron Sengir, but he was taken, so I took the character that wanted to kill him, recalls Chris. In my opinion, Sandra did fantastic with the art direction of the set. All of the art is great, and leaning on Pete Venters and Christopher Rush for your flagship cards was an inspired decision. I really cannot praise the art and art direction of this set enough. It's fantastic. As the artists received their cards and the histories, the final reports from the playtesters began to arrive. By mid-April, all of the results had been gathered, and the R&D team set to work considering the opinions and concerns of the playtesters. Most cards required minor adjustment to statistics or casting costs, others were completely rewritten. Since the artists had already begun creating the pictures according to the titles and descriptions sent to them weeks earlier, the developers attempted to keep the new powers in line with the artwork in progress. So that's really interesting, because I usually hear that little development was done for this set, but they completely rewrote some of these cards and adjusted mana costs. What the fuck did these cards look like before they did that? This is fucking crazy. By the end of April, R&D was ready to send the set into editing. Darla Willis, the lead Magic editor, coordinated the enormous task of rewording the cards. Working closely with the Magic R&D team, she developed wording for each card that was succinct and accurate, and made sure that both the content and style of cards were consistent with existing sets. Often, the new card powers required that new templates be developed or rules text be trimmed to fit. The cards were reworded numerous times before both R&D and editing were satisfied. Wow, well, that explains part of the problem. What the fuck did these cards look like if the final result is considered succinct and accurate? Like, holy shit. Alright, I'm reading between the lines here, but if it says that R&D and editing were both satisfied, I imagine that neither were satisfied. The absolute garbage text on these cards has to be the result of petty compromise, at least in my opinion. Maybe not, but that's what it seems like to me. There's more to this article, but it's mostly talking about the effort that went into the flavor text and the difficulties with Homelands being the first set to have a worldwide release. Those bits are really interesting, but aren't really relevant to the point of this video. The last paragraph is pretty funny in retrospect, though. The designers have been anxious to see the results of their efforts. No one can say for certain, however, just what will happen once these cards become available to millions of players. Over time, the strengths of Homelands will surface in unpredictable ways as it becomes more and more a part of the growing multiverse of Domina. We know that this is going to be a controversial set, says Scott, but we can't wait to see how people respond to it. Okay, so I just want to take this opportunity to say that I'm not trying to make fun of or bully anyone that was involved with this set. I'm honestly not even certain as to who deserves the blame for Homelands having some of the most unappealing and terrible game pieces in the game's history. A lot of effort and care went into the art and the story and hell, even the design. And I think it does a fantastic job of the art and the story, and some of the design is close to interesting, but I do think it misses the mark on the game piece side of things. And speaking of mark, in episode 87 of Drive to Work, Mark Rosewater discusses 1995 and briefly talks about Homelands and what went wrong. Here's what he had to say.
So Homelands was the first set that really did not get a super strong fan reaction. It was a very flavorful set. I've gone on record as saying that I believe Homelands is the worst design set in Magic history. And real quickly, the story behind it is when they realized that Magic was going to go big, both Richard and Peter each went to different people and had asked them to work on Magic sets. Or people, in Peter's case, I think people came to Peter because Magic had been successful and asked if they could make a Magic set. And the two people, it was Scott Hungerford and Kyle Memvar. Kyle, I think, was the head of the customer service, and Scott, also known as Scooter, was on the continuity at the time, what we call the creative team, at the time it was called continuity. And they had made a set that was super, super flavorful, but neither one of them were really game designers. They had no sort of technical, at least with Magic, and when they had turned the set in, R&D was not happy with it. And R&D at the time, which mostly was the East Coast playtesters and Richard, said that they didn't think we should print it. And Peter overruled them and said, no, I promised him we would do it. And so there's a lot of tension around that set. I think that R&D at the time, because they were very upset, said, oh, okay, Peter, if you think this is so good, we don't want to change it, and lose its vision. So they really did not do a lot of development on it. Because they were very frustrated that they were being forced to put it out when they did not think it was acceptable. And so Homelands definitely had this issue of it came out, it had some design issues, it wasn't strongly developed. And so it was the first set that really kind of made a sour taste in the sense that it was perceived publicly as not being very good.
Yeah, so that's what Mark Rosewater had to say on this, and I have no idea how true it is. It does go a little against what was printed in the Duelist, but is the Duelist really going to say that the development team pissed and moaned about this set while trying to sell it? Probably not. There's probably quite a bit of truth and merit to this. I just don't know that for certain. I think the only thing that we really know is that we probably never will know exactly what happened here. But there's likely a grain of truth to this. We do have one more bit of information that I'd like to go over. This next article was slapped right in the middle of the Making of the Magic expansion article that we just went over, and doesn't have an author credit, so I think that Christopher Ferris wrote this bit as well, but fuck if I know. Baron Sengir is an excellent example of a card that went through a great deal of transformations. Much of it even before the research and development team saw the card. The original Baron was designed to be a vampire lord who would lead the Sengir vampires. An early version had a casting cost of 3 BBB and was a 5/5 creature with flying. The card text read, tap Baron to regenerate vampire. Regenerated vampires lose all counters. Each time Baron kills an opponent, gains a +1/+1 counter. Well, formatting issues and ambiguous word choice aside, that's a decent but not broken card. This version was designed before Legends had been released, and it contained the old tap text configuration, which was later revised. I see what you did there. And used opponent instead of creature. The next version increased the Baron's power to 6/6, and the wording was clarified to indicate which counters the Sengir vampires would lose. Throughout these functional changes, the flavor text remained the same. Eventually, the Baron was reduced again to a 5/5 and became a legend with a casting cost of 3 RBU. Soon after, however, came the December continuity catastrophe, and in the ensuing changes, the Baron's rule over the barony was reduced to 200 years, and the card was returned to an all-black casting cost, though the Baron retained his legendary status. This was the version that R&D received as part of the submission in January. As R&D worked to refine the casting cost and the abilities of the card, they were concerned that the card didn't accurately reflect the power that they felt the Baron should possess. Its casting cost was raised to 5 BBB, its counter benefit was raised to +2/+2, and the text was written in the latest template. Wait, they were concerned that the card didn't accurately reflect the power that they felt the Baron should possess, so they raised the casting cost? That's really funny. And sure, they gave it the +2/+2 ability, but fuck, come on, man. Anyway, they had to shorten the flavor text, but that's not really relevant to what I'm discussing here. It's crazy that Sengir was almost Grixis. That's pretty funny. You can see elements with that with Castle Sengir. Man, if that was how it was, you could play Castle Sengir in your Sengir commander deck. How fucking cool. This whole thing seems like a fucking shit show. This set started sprinting and immediately tripped over its own feet when the lore guy didn't turn the page in his lore information, which was just publicly released information. That's baffling to me. It's kind of ironic that the mechanic guy thought Antiquities should be stronger, and this is the set he helped to design. Not to say the bad cards are his fault. Many of these cards were apparently rewritten, and it makes me wonder who's responsible for most of my complaints, especially since the Baron Sengir card was pretty decent before development got its hands on it. I strongly believe that this set would have been sick as fuck and interesting to play if they just removed a sentence from like half these cards, removed some of the timing restrictions they put on them, and just took like a mana off of like 95% of the set, and maybe 2 mana off in a few cases. I think this set was so close to being a decent set with fun and playable cards, but something on the inside caused these cards to be garbage, and I'm really curious about what actually happened. It's so fucking baffling to me. Unfortunately, I couldn't really find any more information on the development of this set, and I was hoping to have more definitive answers when trying to figure out why this set sucks so bad. But we got partway there, and I guess it is what it is. Oh yeah, I might as well mention here that Memory Lapse was actually part of Mirage, but was moved over to Homelands when a different card was cut, for whatever reason. Which makes a lot of sense. Anyway, if you have any more information, or even just an uninformed opinion you like, I would love to hear it, so drop a comment. But that's all I have for today. You can like the video if you liked it. You can subscribe if you give a shit. But either way, I hope you have a magical day. Thank you for watching.